The grim, towering walls of St. Bernard Prison stood as a silent testament to the suffering within. Its cold, gray exterior mirrored the despair of those trapped behind bars. Among the many hardened criminals was Thomas, a man known for his distant, unapproachable nature, serving time for theft. His past was filled with mistakes, guilt, and regret, weighing heavily on his soul in the solitude of his cell. Little did he know, his life was about to change in a way he never expected. Enter Sister Grace, a nun whose unwavering kindness and belief in redemption would offer Thomas a chance to rebuild his life. But could this unlikely source of hope truly change his fate? St. Bernard Prison was infamous for holding the region's most dangerous and hardened criminals. Its towering stone walls seemed to echo with the sorrow and desperation of broken men, each one serving out their sentences for crimes that had come to define their entire lives. Among these men was Thomas, a man in his 40s, sentenced for a series of thefts that had sent him down a dark, lonely road. Inside the prison, Thomas was known for his quiet demeanor. His face was often clouded with a sadness that his fellow inmates couldn't quite comprehend. He kept to himself, never seeking out the company of others. There were no friendships here for Thomas, no glimmer of hope. Each day in the prison felt like an eternity, a constant reminder of the choices he had made that not only destroyed his life but also impacted the lives of others in ways he could never undo. Thomas had long since given up on any hope of a future beyond the cold, iron gates of St. Bernard. The world outside seemed like a distant dream, one that no longer had a place for him. His mistakes had buried him too deeply. But then something changed. Sister Grace, a woman known for her deep faith and unwavering compassion, began visiting St. Bernard. Her presence was like a breath of fresh air in the stifling gloom of the prison. She came not just to offer charity, but to bring a message of redemption. Her visits, though brief, were a source of curiosity for the inmates and guards alike. But for Thomas, it was more than just the arrival of a nun. It was the first sign of something different, something that might offer him the chance to find his way back. What Sister Grace didn't know, though, was how deep Thomas's despair ran, nor how desperately he needed someone to show him a path to redemption. Would her visits be the beginning of the change he so desperately needed? Only time would tell. Sister Grace had long been a familiar sight at St. Bernard, known for her unwavering dedication to charitable work. Each week, like clockwork, she walked through the prison gates, her face calm and serene, her habit immaculate despite the grim surroundings. The guards had grown used to her presence over time, but there was one thing that seemed to unsettle them. While many of the inmates would come and go from her visits, Sister Grace always spent more time with Thomas than anyone else. "What's she doing here so often?" the guards would whisper amongst themselves. "Why him? What's going on between them?" It wasn't hard to see why they were curious. Thomas, the man known for his isolation and cold demeanor, was hardly the type of person anyone would expect Sister Grace to focus on. He had served years in St. Bernard, sentenced for a series of thefts that had led him down a spiral of guilt and regret. He was known as a quiet man, distant and withdrawn, his face always marked by a sorrow too deep for the others to understand. For months, Sister Grace had been a fixture in Thomas's life. Her visits were a routine that he had started to depend on, though he would never admit it. He never asked for her visits, never showed any interest in being saved, but there was something in her presence that made him feel seen. She would sit across from him in the small meeting room, her soft voice cutting through the silence. She didn't rush him to speak or demand answers. She simply offered him her time, her listening ear, and most importantly, her belief that he was more than the sum of his mistakes. Despite the rumors swirling among the guards and inmates, Sister Grace never wavered. She did not see a criminal when she looked at Thomas. She saw a man burdened by regret, someone whose heart was heavy with the weight of his past, but also someone who still had the potential to change. At first, Thomas resisted. He was skeptical of her kindness, unsure of why she chose to spend so much time with him, of all people. What was it that she saw in him? In the cold, echoing silence of his prison cell, he had long since given up on any idea of redemption. After all, who could ever forgive someone like him? But as the weeks went by, something slowly started to shift. Her belief in him, though unspoken, began to chip away at the walls he had built around himself. Sister Grace wasn't trying to change him overnight. There was no judgment in her eyes, no harsh words. Instead, she offered a hand, one that he had never expected. "Thomas," she would say softly during their meetings, "I believe you are more than what you've done. There is still good in you, and that goodness can lead you to a different path. It's never too late to start again." Her words, simple as they were, had a power that Thomas had not anticipated. They stirred something inside of him, something he had buried deep within for years. The guilt, the shame, the regrets. They had ruled his life for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to hope, to believe that things could ever be different. With each visit, Sister Grace gave him a glimpse of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: the possibility of redemption. It wasn't about erasing his past. It was about understanding it, learning from it, and finding a way to move forward. Her consistent presence in his life became a small but constant reminder that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond saving. Though the guards and inmates continued to whisper, Sister Grace was undeterred. She focused only on the man before her, determined to help him break free from the prison of his past, even if the walls surrounding him remained unyielding. And as Thomas sat across from her, listening, for the first time in years, he began to wonder if he could ever truly find peace with himself. Could he ever forgive himself for his past? Could he change, not for the world, but for himself? As the days turned to weeks, Sister Grace's visits began to have an undeniable effect. The quiet, sorrowful man known as Thomas began to show glimpses of something new, something akin to hope. It was a slow process, but for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't defined by his past mistakes. And as the whispers of the guards and inmates continued to circulate, one thing became clear. Sister Grace had done more than just visit a man in prison. She had given him a chance to rediscover who he truly was, and maybe, just maybe, help him find a way out of the prison he had built for himself inside his own heart. It was during one of these visits that Sister Grace spoke up, her voice calm but filled with a quiet resolve. She looked at Thomas across the table, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Thomas," she began, "I know who you are." Thomas, puzzled and taken aback, looked up from his hands. "What do you mean?" Sister Grace took a deep breath, her expression soft yet firm. "Years ago, when I first arrived at the St. Raphael orphanage, we had a theft. Someone took all the money we had raised for the children. Money meant for food, clothing, and medical care." Thomas's eyes widened with shock, his heart sinking into his stomach. He hadn't known the money was for the children, but he knew the guilt that had haunted him ever since. His voice trembled as he whispered, "I didn't know it was for the kids. I was just desperate. I had no other choice." For a moment, there was silence, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. But Sister Grace didn't flinch. She didn't recoil in judgment or anger. Instead, she spoke with warmth, her voice steady and understanding. "I'm not here to judge you, Thomas," she said softly. "I'm here to help you find a way forward." For the first time in years, Thomas felt something stir deep within him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. It wasn't anger or resentment in her words, but compassion. Sister Grace wasn't looking at him as the man he had been, but as the man he could become. In that moment, he realized something that would change him forever. Someone cared, not for the mistakes he had made, but for the possibility of what he could still achieve. Her belief in him felt like a light in the darkness, and for the first time, he wondered if redemption was possible. Sister Grace's visits became more frequent, and with each one, their conversations grew deeper. At first, they had been simple exchanges, just her offering words of comfort and kindness, and him responding with guarded silence. But as the weeks passed, something began to shift. There was a trust developing between them, a quiet understanding that allowed Thomas to open up in ways he hadn't for years. She didn't just talk to him about his past mistakes. Instead, she asked him questions that he hadn't dared to ask himself for a long time. One day, as they sat in the small, sterile room, Sister Grace looked at him thoughtfully and asked, "Have you ever thought about what you'd like to do once you're out of here?" Thomas, taken off guard by the question, shook his head. I've never really thought about it. I never had a plan. The weight of his words hung in the air. He had been so consumed by his past, so weighed down by the guilt of his actions, that the future had seemed like a distant, unreachable place. Sister Grace smiled gently, her eyes full of understanding. It's never too late to start building something. Her voice was calm but filled with a quiet conviction, as if she truly believed that change was possible, even for someone like him. Thomas had a hard time accepting that idea, but her words lingered in his mind long after she had left the prison. It was as if a small spark of hope had been ignited in his chest, a spark that, despite his doubts, refused to die out. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering if it might be possible to create a future for himself, one that was different from the bleak, isolated life he had always known. The thoughts were fleeting at first, like a whisper in the back of his mind. Could he really build something, anything, after all he had done? But slowly, those whispers began to grow louder. He started to realize that the life he had been living didn't have to define the rest of his existence. As the days passed, Thomas began to talk more openly about the guilt he carried, the mistakes that haunted him every waking moment. With each confession, Sister Grace listened patiently, offering nothing but kindness and compassion in return. She never pushed him to hurry through his healing. She let him speak when he was ready, never judging, never rushing. One day, during a visit, Sister Grace handed Thomas a small wooden rosary. It was simple, unadorned, but there was something about it that felt significant. She looked at him gently and said, "This isn't just a symbol of faith," she explained, her voice warm. "It's a reminder that every day is a new opportunity to do better." Thomas took the rosary in his hands, feeling its smooth surface, and his heart tightened in his chest. It wasn't just a gift, it felt like a lifeline. In that moment, he understood that Sister Grace wasn't just giving him an object, she was offering him a chance, a reminder that each day could be a new beginning. The weight of his past no longer had to control him. Each day could be a step forward. Overwhelmed with emotion, Thomas clutched the rosary tightly. It wasn't just a reminder of faith, it was a symbol of something more profound. It was a symbol of hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he thought had died inside of him. The possibility of change. The rosary became a constant companion, something he held on to during the long, lonely nights in his cell. It reminded him of the promise that Sister Grace had made to him, that he was not beyond saving, that he had the power to rebuild himself, even if it seemed impossible. With each passing day, Thomas began to feel different. The heaviness of his past didn't disappear, but it became more bearable. He started to think about his future, the life he could build once he was free. He didn't know exactly what that life would look like, but for the first time in years, he believed it was possible to have one. Sister Grace's belief in him, her quiet faith in his potential, was transforming him. It wasn't an overnight change, but each visit, each word of encouragement, was a small step toward redemption. And with the rosary in his hand, Thomas found himself taking those steps, one day at a time, toward a future he had never dared to imagine. Though he still struggled with the weight of his past, he knew now that he wasn't alone in facing it. Sister Grace was there, showing him that the road to redemption didn't have to be walked alone, and that, no matter how far he had fallen, he could still rise again. Thomas's transformation wasn't easy. The solitude of his prison cell often felt suffocating, as memories of his past mistakes weighed heavily on his mind. There were nights when he would stare at the small wooden rosary, turning it over and over in his hands, wrestling with the questions that seemed to haunt him at every turn. Could he ever forgive himself? Could he ever escape the crushing guilt that had defined so much of his life? Forgiveness isn't just something you can receive from others, Sister Grace had told him during one of her visits. It's something you must give to yourself. Her words echoed in his mind, but they didn't offer immediate relief. In fact, they left him with even more questions. How could he forgive himself for the harm he had caused? How could he erase the years of mistakes that had left such a deep mark on his soul? It wasn't an easy lesson to learn. Thomas often found himself fighting against the anger and regret that had festered within him for so long. But each day, as he held the rosary, something inside him shifted. At first, it was barely noticeable, a small flicker of peace in the midst of his turmoil. Slowly, over time, that flicker grew into something more. The anger that had once consumed him began to dissipate. The regrets that had held him in their grip for years began to loosen. The rosary, once just a symbol of faith, became something deeper, a tool for reflection, a constant reminder that change was possible, even for someone like him. With every passing day, as he held it, Thomas found the strength to face his past and begin to heal. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could choose to move forward, to stop being defined by his mistakes. A quiet determination began to take root within him. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic shift, but rather a steady, gradual transformation. The weight of guilt didn't disappear, but it became more manageable. He knew that redemption was a journey, one that would take time, effort, and self-forgiveness. But for the first time in years, Thomas believed he was on the right path. As weeks turned into months, a noticeable change began to take shape in Thomas. The hardened, distant man he once was seemed to fade, replaced by someone different, a man with a renewed sense of purpose. His eyes, once clouded with guilt and sorrow, now held a quiet determination. He was no longer just passing the time. He was striving to better himself, to make up for the wrongs he had done. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. The other inmates started to talk. The guards started to observe. Thomas had become more engaged, more present in the world around him. He was no longer the man who kept to himself, consumed by regret. Instead, he was someone with a plan. A man who wanted to make things right, no matter how small the step. One of the most significant changes came when Thomas began working on a project in the prison carpentry workshop. It wasn't just any project, though. It was a bookshelf, a symbol of his redemption. He had asked the workshop supervisor for permission, and with a quiet sense of conviction, he explained his reason for the project. "I'd like to build something for the orphanage," Thomas said, his voice steady. "A way to give back what I took." The supervisor, impressed by Thomas's sincerity and dedication, agreed to let him work on the bookshelf during his free time. Every evening, after finishing his shift, Thomas would return to the workshop, his hands steady as he worked. The sound of the hammer and saw became a rhythm, a daily reminder of his journey. That simple bookshelf became more than just a piece of furniture. It was a reflection of Thomas's own journey. It was a symbol of the man he was striving to become, a man who had finally realized that redemption wasn't just about forgiveness from others, but also about taking tangible steps toward change. And with every stroke of the hammer, Thomas was building something meaningful, both for the children at the orphanage and for himself. Finally, the day arrived when Thomas felt ready to face the orphanage. He stood tall, holding the bookshelf he had crafted with his own hands, a physical representation of the man he had become. But more than the bookshelf, it was a testament to the new version of himself that had emerged over the months. A man who had come to terms with his past and was now prepared to make amends. As Thomas arrived at the orphanage, a sense of nervous anticipation washed over him. The children, curious about the man who had written them the letter, gathered around him, their innocent faces filled with questions. Among them, a little girl stepped forward, her eyes wide with curiosity. She looked up at him and asked softly, "Are you the one who wrote us the letter?" Thomas felt his heart pound in his chest. This moment was more significant than he had imagined. He nodded, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Yes, I am. And I'm here to tell you that I'm sorry for what I did. I can't change the past, but I want to do my best to make things right." The little girl smiled up at him, her innocence shining through. "We liked your letter. It's nice to know that even grown-ups can change." Her words hit Thomas with the force of a wave, washing over him in a rush of relief and emotion. For the first time in years, he felt truly forgiven, not just by the children, but by himself. The guilt that had once weighed so heavily on his soul seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet peace. As the children admired the bookshelf he had built for them, Thomas realized that the journey to redemption was not just about making up for the past, but about embracing the possibility of a better future. The simple act of showing up, of apologizing, and of offering something of himself had changed everything. And in that moment, Thomas understood that real change came not just from words, but from actions. Thomas's journey was far from over, but he had made incredible progress. His story had spread throughout the community, touching hearts and inspiring others to believe in second chances and the transformative power of forgiveness. One Sunday, during a church service, Sister Grace invited Thomas to speak to the congregation. He was nervous, standing at the front, the weight of the moment pressing on him. But as he gazed out at the familiar faces in the crowd, a sense of peace began to wash over him, calming his nerves. Years ago, Thomas began, his voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. I thought my life was over. I was trapped by my mistakes, consumed by guilt, and didn't believe I deserved a second chance. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. But then I met someone who saw something different in me, something I couldn't see in myself. Thanks to Sister Grace, I learned that forgiveness isn't just a word. It's an action. And now, I'm here to tell you that change is possible if you find someone willing to believe in you. His words resonated deeply with the congregation. As Thomas finished speaking, the room was silent for a moment, and then many people who had once distanced themselves from the church stepped forward, offering their support and gratitude. They thanked him for his courage and shared their own stories of forgiveness and transformation. For the first time, Thomas realized the true impact of his journey. It wasn't just about his own redemption. It was about inspiring others to believe that no matter how lost someone may seem, change was always possible. Thomas's story is a powerful reminder that no one is beyond redemption. No matter how heavy our past mistakes or how difficult self-forgiveness may seem, it's never too late to change. If Thomas could transform his life, so can anyone. What part of Thomas's journey resonated with you the most? Do you believe people can truly change? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of redemption and hope. Thank you for watching.